Hi, I'm Dylan Dalbeck, and I'll be interviewing my dad about the Cold War.
Hi, my name is Brad Dalbeck, and I'm here with Dylan, and he's going to ask me some questions, I guess, about the Cold War. It's too bad. I'm actually the oldest living relative on my side of the family. Both my parents are deceased, who definitely lived through that era. His other grandparents have not, they're a little older and probably wouldn't be able to stand in front of the video here like I'm doing. So we'll do the best we can to get through this. And Dylan has a few questions, I guess, and I'll give it my best shot. So go ahead,
All
Dylan.
right. What is your strongest memory on the Cold War?
Um, Again, I was very, very young through that time, and it actually began before I was born. The heat of it, I guess, with the Cuban Missile Crisis and everything, was I was about 10 years old. Although it went on till probably our firstborn, Lindsay. So it was a long time frame. The biggest thing I remember is when I was probably 10 or 9 years old, is that people were so afraid of the possibility of nuclear attacks that people were building bunkers and uh, bomb shelters and in hopes and preparing for devastation in the country because there was so much of a concern that the Russians or anybody, the Chinese at the time, the Koreans later on, would have enough capability to send a nuclear warhead to the United States. And most Americans saw the end of World War II, where um, Hiroshima, the big first atomic bomb, blew up and killed thousands of people and devastated a city. They saw what the outcome could be. So, it was kind of crazy. I mean, it was even highlighted in a few. I don't know if you remember the show Happy Days. There was a couple episodes in Happy Days, which was kind of talked about the 1950s, and they even had a show I remember about that, about their neighbors building bomb shelters, and you don't see that nowadays, but people were generally scared about that. So it was kind of interesting that people would go that far. There was people that were nutty that would build huge bunkers in their backyards and buy food for years of to be able to withstand what might go on if there was a nuclear attack. So that's really my strongest memory. But,
Was it scary living through that?
well, I was young, so for me it was not. My parents, I think, weren't that affected as most people, but obviously, if people are building bunkers in their backyards, maybe just being trying to be prepared, not so much being scared. But my parents didn't build a bunker, but it was definitely throughout. You could read through the media and through the whole country that it was definitely a concern for people that with the Communist Party trying to overtake the European area, and that it could happen someday. So it definitely was a concern to people.
In your opinion, why did they call it the Cold War?
It was just many many years of conflict. I should say there was no conflict through years of back and forth. Whether it be rhetoric from the politicians or whatever, but there was never a physical conflict, and it just kind of went on and on through the years with the possibility of communism taking over and the possibility of nuclear war. Uh, but there was really never a physical fight over it. So they deemed it the Cold War because of there was never that physical conflict. There was a lot of times where it could have. I mean, down in Cuba, we there was a big standoff, but there really never was a war from that. So I think that through the many years of just not, having that and being verbal back and forth jabberish and stuff, it just never came to a conflict, and so they called it the Cold War.
Now, do you have any recollection of your parents' perception of the early stages of the war and the impact it had on you?
Um, not so much because something we probably didn't talk about too much because I was young. The things that really affected me personally and were very emotional was in the Vietnam era when we were fighting the communists of North Vietnam. I was turning 18 right around the time the war was getting over, but they still had the mandatory draft. So it was a very strong possibility that I could have been drafted and forced to go to be in the army or whatever. And although I was only just 17, turning 18, I definitely would have been a against the war. I would have been fighting an activistic, fighting against the going to war. And my belief is that I did not want to go fight. I mean, if I had to, obviously I would have, but if I had my choice, I absolutely would not. And my parents, I remember, my mother was very emotional because it was so close to me having to go to fight. And when they did change that, and I don't remember whether if it was 2 days or 2 months, but it was very close to when I was turning 18. So it was a very big relief and emotional relief for us as a family that they did change that. So that's really my biggest the biggest impact it had on me emotionally.
Yeah. What thoughts do you have on the Bay of Pigs invasion?
Well, you know what? Actually, that contradicts what I said. That was the one time that, and it really wasn't us. I know that our country, we wanted to try to stop, the country of Cuba from possibly joining up with the Soviet Union and possibly getting, nuclear warheads down there. My recollection is that we tried to train some of Cuban people to overthrow the government, and so it really wasn't a conflict with us. But I know that it did fail, and it moved on to different conflicts. But it was kind of smart, I guess, on our country, because rather than go to war and possibly get into a nuclear war, I think it was Truman was the president at the time, maybe. They made a decision to try to overthrow the government and train Cuban army to do that. And of course, it did fail, but I guess it was pretty smart of mine, because it was a very scary time that nobody knew what was going to happen. They saw the results again of the atomic bomb in Japan and what could happen, and so I think it was probably pretty smart for them to try to do it that way, even though it did fail. And then we went on to other things, but.
Do you have any recollection of the Cuban Missile Crisis or what your parents felt about it?
Yeah, I actually do remember, even though I was young, that was probably the most memorable time, I think. I mean, there's the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and so on and so forth. But really, that era when the possibility of Cuba, which is so close to our country, I mean, you see there's people swimming to the United States trying to be free. But back in those days, it was pretty scary, because Cuba, we had stopped all ties with Cuba, and Cuba was getting close to the Soviet Union, and we were very scared that they were possibly going to, bring ballistic missiles or atomic missiles to Cuba, and it would be very close, and they could possibly get to the United States. So. It was a huge impact. I mean, when President Kennedy was in power and he had the big standoff with them, I mean, that was just all over the news and all over the media and all over the country, and that's what everybody talked about. What was going to happen, and that standoff was probably one of the most critical standoffs in the Cold War, I believe. With the standoff, when Kennedy brought all the ships and basically surrounded the country, who knows what could have happened? It could have gone into a full-scale war. A number of things in that era, happened. The NASA was developed, and we were fighting in outer space to try to get the first guy to the moon. We were fighting to, obviously, I think Soviet Union wanted to get ballistic missiles to try to see if they could get warheads in the air to get to our country. So it was a critical time in American history and Cuban history and the Soviet history. So it was a scary time. Although I was young, it was very visible that even in school we would talk about those things.
Do you remember the John Kennedy's assassination and how it affected the country?
I do remember the assassination very well, because I was young, and I had actually the day he was shot, I had a babysitter, and she was a very, very old lady. And because I can remember this is really not about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but my babysitter fell, and she was, I don't remember honestly if she was passed out or whatever, but she was down on the ground, and I had to call the police. And I didn't know what I did is I ended up calling the police backwards. Whatever the number was, I called the number backwards, and she stayed there till my parents actually came home, because I was not able to help her. But because of that incident, I remember it very well. And I remember watching the funeral of Kennedy when I was little. and it really was. He had such a impact on the country with the Cuban Missile Crisis and his standoff against Cuba that he was so well respected in the country that boy, millions and millions of people watched. People were just shocked at when he was assassinated, and it's all people talked about. And you know, his big thing was the Cuban Missile Crisis and his standoff with Cuba. So it was a very memorable time, even though I was young in American history.
So you thought what he was doing was good and helped the country
Oh,
overall?
absolutely. I mean, you know, whether you're Democratic, Republican, I think most people, because it was such a vulnerable time in the United States, that he was very well thought of, and you know, by holding off what could have been a really tense situation and possible nuclear war, he was very well liked through the country, and he was a great speaker. He was very pro-country, and yeah, he was very well thought of.
Now, on the nuclear war, what was your feelings about the threat of nuclear war and how the world could just be destroyed?
Well, you know, we saw at the end of World War II what nuclear war can do. And, you know, so you saw the powers that these bombs have and the devastation that they have. You know, you could level half of Massachusetts or, you know, at least Boston surrounding area with a nuclear warhead. And so that scared people, I think. You know, although it never came, but it was so close. Again, you know, I talked earlier about that people were building bomb shelters and going crazy, and um, people were generally scared. You know, once you see what something can do, it really has a much more visual impact on you to see. If we never saw the bomb in Hiroshima, you know, it may not have been such a serious thing, but it came very, very close in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I believe that, you know, Fidel Castro and Cuba, they probably would have teamed up with the Soviet Union, and if communism had spread, if we didn't fight Korea, if we didn't fight in Vietnam, if we didn't fight in Cuba, that communism would have spread, and that more people would have gotten their hands on nuclear warheads. It could have been really devastating to us or to some of our allies over in Europe. So it was a tense time in our country and other countries too.
And they had commercials on TV about the nuclear war and what to do if it happens. Did you ever see any of those or feel?
You know, I don't remember commercials. I mean, heck, I think we were the first people in our neighborhood to have a color television. So, you know, when I was very young, a radio was how you got information, and then you know TVs came out, and you know then color TVs, but. I don't really have a memory of that, but I could remember people talking about it, and neighbors that were building these things, and it was a very obviously strong concern of people in those times.
Do you have any reflections on the Korean War or what happened there?
Well, my dad was in the Korean War, your grandfather, so he was in the middle of that at that time. He met his wife, my mom, through that time. She was a nurse or something, and they met, I think, in England or something. You know, the Korean War was, again, it was similar to you know, Vietnam, and similar to the Cuban. We were afraid that North Korea would take over South Korea and you know force communism through more of that you know part of the world, and you know, it was another stalemate type of a war where, you know, we fought, we pushed forward into North Korea and got way up, and they put a strong offensive, and they pushed us down, and then I think it ended up somewhere in the middle, and then they finally had a ceasefire. But the bottom line is our country has always been steadfast and against communism and the results that communism would have on a country, and that's the one thing we've done and been straightforward through all of our years, is that you know we'll fight communism, and that's what we did in Korea. And my dad was definitely part of that, and I think your other grandfather, Grampy, was part of that too, and so they lived through it. But again, it was just another time to fight off communism in other countries.
Now, the threat of communism, and if one country fell, that others around would fall too. Did that like affect you at all?
Me personally, no, but you know, as we fought all these different battles through these many years, I mean, what is it, from the 40s to the early 90s is really the Cold War era, whether it be in Soviet Union or Korea or Vietnam, it was always brought that possibility of communism spreading through Europe and Eastern Europe and Asia and stuff that we were always concerned about. And again, Kennedy was probably the forefront fighter of all that. That we were not going to allow those things to happen in these countries, and we follow our democracy in our country and are very strong about that. And we just constantly fought that battle.
Now, do you remember the Vietnam War at all?
I do. That was through my teens and early 20s years. Again, I was very against the war, and again, I talked about how, I could have been drafted to be in the Vietnam War. A lot of my friends' older brothers, some of them were in the Vietnam War and stuff, so I was personally affected by that. I did not know anyone that died personally, which is a good thing, although thousands and thousands of lives were lost over in Vietnam. But it was a very strange time in the United States because the media, in World War II and in earlier times, you heard things weeks later. Vietnam was the first war that the media was really able to project what was going on. But there was a lot of things that were held back from the country in the war where, we didn't get the full story about things that were happening in Vietnam. There was a lot of people in this country that believed we were in somewhere we shouldn't have been. Nobody knew what Vietnam was and why we were there, and that was a constant battle between young people believing that we shouldn't be there and the government that was over there again fighting communism. North Vietnam was a communistic state, and South Vietnam we were helping, but a lot of people didn't see the reason why we needed to be over there in that continent to fight. But again, it was the country's belief that we did not want communism to spread, and that war was a devastating war. A lot of young people died for that fight, and it's too bad because it really never resolved anything. Although kind of stalemated and stayed the same, kind of like in Korea, but a lot of people's lives were lost, which is unfortunate.
In the Tet Offensive there, that was said to have changed the thoughts of many Americans' idea of the war.
Well, it did. I do remember once we got into Vietnam, we were in a fight, but the country is a thick jungle, and our normal, I guess, offensive ways or tactics, I guess, were not really working the same in the jungle environment. So it was a different fight for the Americans, and a lot of lives were lost, and was a harder fight. The Tet Offensive was when North Korea, the Communist Party, decided, the war was kind of at a stalemate, and they went out and hit, hundreds of different cities in South Vietnam and tried to overtake the South Vietnam country. I think, as I remember, what happened is that they were hoping that people in South Vietnam and the cities, when they went in to take them over, would partner up with them, and then they'd have a stronger hold on it. But as they went in and devastated these cities, the people still were against North Vietnam. So it ended up not being a successful mission, although they attacked hundreds of cities in South Vietnam, and but they weren't able to keep the stronghold on them. So. But what it did back in America is that it really showed that it's a fight we may not win, and it made the younger people of the United States much stronger against war. And man, there was rallies, there was just thousands and thousands of people getting together against the war, and it was a very vocal time in American history not to be at war. And this Tet Offensive just kind of showed that we possibly could not win this war. And again, it was over trying to keep communism out of the rest of the country. But it was a tough time in American history.
And then the North Vietnamese used Cambodia, and then we started a secret war with Cambodia. What did you feel about that?
Well, Cambodia was kind of a neutral area. And, that was when I was talking earlier about how the media is involved. They call it the secret war of Cambodia because really because it was such a kind of a stagnant area. We went after Cambodia, but nobody knew here. And I think we found out later when Nixon was president, when they released tapes or documents or whatever that were classified, and but nobody knew that we were in there bombing Cambodia, and I think we had thousands of bombing missions in there, but nobody in America knew about it. And this gets back to this kind of fight that the media had with getting everything back to the country, because we never knew about that, and that's why they call it the secret Cambodian War. We didn't know till years later, but that was a strong offensive that the government was putting on without the knowledge of the American people, and so that's what, again, it made it a very critical time in American history. This war was very controversial and still is today, talking about it, but. It was a tough time, but that was all secretive, and we didn't. I think we found out in the '90s or whenever Nixon was president when they released, secret documents. So.
Now, when you found out, were you disappointed that the country kept it a secret, or?
Personally, I mean, by that time, we were out of the Vietnam War then. You didn't think about it that much. It just reiterated our beliefs back then were very true, that this war was kind of a waste. Thousands of lives got lost. The government was not being honest with the country about what we were doing and why we were there. So it just kind of reiterated all those things that people were fighting for back then.
The threat of communism today, is it the same as it was back when the Cold War was taking part?
No. There's still the only effect or countries that are really a concern now is Korea. North Korea, again, even today, is threatening to detonate atomic bombs, and the threat of possibly having that, and this is how many, 30, 40, 50 years after the Korean War. But, the end of the Cold War, really, when the Soviet Union kind of split apart, that, the end really was in 1991, and Russia split apart, and they had their own concerns with people were starving in their country and everything, so their focus was really, regrouping their little new countries, and now our only really biggest concern, communism-wise, is in Korea. We have the Middle East, obviously, which is the biggest threat right now, but North Korea is probably still a concern, and always, our government's always over there battling what we should and shouldn't do.
And throughout the war, what was your opinion of the Soviet Union and what they were doing?
Well, the whole from the start of the Cold War right through till the end, the Soviet Union was really the heart of this, because we saw them as this probably the strongest threat to communism spreading in Europe from the early days in Western European. I mean, when the Berlin Wall finally was taken down and that split the two sides of Germany, that was really what kind of set the end of the possibility of the Cold War continuing. Soviet Union was the biggest population country. It was the biggest threat at the time. And although we did go to Korea, we did go to Vietnam, the Soviet Union was always there. And through the days of Stalin and Soviet Union and Gorbachev, our relations were always back and forth. And but the Soviet Union was always there, and the biggest threat to possibly controlling more of Europe and taking over communism, and then possibly getting a hold of nuclear warheads, and so they were always kind of the central concern of the world.
Are the relationships with the Soviet Union or Russia now different than they were back in the Cold War?
Oh yeah, Russia is a totally different area now. It's it was like I think it was the early '90s, '91 it broke up, and the country's divided, and now we have fairly good relations with both Soviet Union and China, and the only really negative relation is with North Korea. That's the last one that's left, but it's totally different now. And through all those different years of leadership, through different leaderships in our country, thank goodness that those relations, when the Cold War ended and they disposed of all the nuclear warheads and all these treaties that came about, it made I think everybody in America and all parts of the world feel a lot more safer.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate the time.
Thank you very much, Dylan. I hope you learned a little bit about it, because it was a very important time in our history, and hopefully we'll never have to deal with these type of things again.
Hopefully. Thank you.
All right, thank you.